I woke up at summer camp as a janitor of sorts. The camp is situated on a secluded island, so there is no flowing water and no electricity outside of the small town. I lived there during the summers, maintaining the facilities and cleaning up after the kids. Boring, I know, but the pay is fair, and I don't have much to do. The only time I ever met a group was the first year the camp was held in 20 years. It was the summer of 2002, late August. It was hot, and the group was very large. To celebrate the last night of camp, some of the older kids had snuck out, silently moving through the palm trees to escape watchful eyes. It was the middle of the night, and the moon was high in the sky, shining with a pale light, making the soft waves sparkle with life. By chance, they had set camp just outside of my cabin. The noise from their speakers and their shouting woke me from a drowsy, alcohol-induced sleep. I dressed and found them dancing and drinking by a blazing fire. I brewed a pot of coffee and waited for them to leave so I could go back to sleep. An hour passed, and their shouting and dancing had quieted down. The music faded away, and the fire was less fierce, but still burning, hot and red. I could see most of them gathering around the flames, speaking softly. Great, I thought. I can finally go back to sleep. But alas, two of the older girls, maybe 15 or 16, approached my cabin. One of them wore a flower-patterned bikini, and the other a pale summer dress. It was hard to discern its color in the darkness. The one in the bikini approached my door, while the other girl hesitated and stayed a few feet back. I went up to the door and opened it, just before she had a chance to knock. She shrieked, a loud and high-pitched shriek that only a teenage girl can make. The sound made me grit my teeth. She almost fell backwards, but her friend caught her, and both of them began to giggle.
We thought this was the rope maker's house,
the one in the dress said, smiling shyly.
We didn't think anyone actually lived here.
Well, I'm only a janitor. I paused to yawn, still tired and sleep-deprived. The legend of the rope maker was just a story we used to tell children. It was about morale, work ethics, and how dedication would lead to success. I vaguely remembered the story from my own youth.
Do you know anything about the legend of the rope maker?
The girl in the bikini asked, with a childish curiosity. I frowned at her. Why were they asking this? I was getting impatient, wanting nothing more than to lie back down in my own bed and read. Maybe I do, and maybe I don't. Sure, I lived here about 30 years ago, but I was only a kid a few years younger than you girls. What do you know about the rope maker, anyway? I asked in an irritated tone.
Only that he died horribly,
said the one in the dress.
They say that he was drowned here,
the other continued.
Would you tell us?
They both asked eagerly, almost skittish.
Please, pretty please,
the girls pleaded, looking at me with big, hopeful eyes. After a deep sigh, I agreed, and they took me by the hand and almost dragged me to the fire. The girls shouted at their friend to quiet down. Teenagers of all shapes and sizes were staring at me, sitting around the fire. An older boy stood. He was smoking a cigarette but threw the butt in the sand and began arguing with the girls, saying that an old man was not welcome at their party. The girls would have none of it, and made him sit down like the rest and keep his mouth shut. They were all waiting for a story. I could tell by the look in their eyes that they were not expecting a story about morale and duty. They were wanting a horror story. And so I decided to tell a story so terrifying that none of them would ever return to disturb my peace again. So, you want to know about the rope maker? I asked in a hushed voice. Most of them nodded or agreed, but some of them looked away, like they didn't care at all. I warn you, I almost whispered now. It is not a story for children. Are you sure about this? Just tell your story, old man, the older boy said in a nonchalant tone that implied that he was not going to be frightened by some janitor's ancient story. I almost felt sorry for them. But nevertheless, I began telling my story. The legend began 30 years ago in a small village that used to be right here, on this very island. The villagers had been living in fear for years and years, never leaving their houses alone, or daring to sleep without their doors locked and bolted, fearing they might never wake again. For there was a serial killer among them. A wolf who had made his way into the herd, and the herd was beginning to thin. No one trusted their friends, colleagues, or neighbors. Both girls and boys alike would be found hanging by their necks from palm trees, their corpses mutilated. The mutilation varied each time. At first the killer would take a finger or toe, maybe an ear. But as he grew bolder, he took eyes, tongues, even genitals. He always kept the parts for trophies.
So, who was he?
The girl in the dress asked. I'm getting there, I replied. Just let me tell the story. The bodies would be found hanging from a tree beside the rope maker's house, I continued. The villagers grew suspicious of the rope maker, but could not prove he was the killer. After 3 years and over 50 murders, the desperate and fearful mayor decided to act. The island had become infamous for its serial killer, and tourists no longer came. He decided to sentence the rope maker, who was just an old man who day in and day out worked on his ropes. He was seemingly harmless, and all agreed he was the kindest old man. But something had to be done. Someone had to pay. They arrested him and tortured him for weeks, trying to get a confession, but to no avail. Between his screams, he would plea his innocence. But they would not listen. In their last attempt to make him confess, they tied his feet to a rock, with rope he was forced to make. Then they carried him out to the beach, just by the edge of the water, and buried the heavy rock in the soft sand. To confess or slowly drown by the inevitable tide were his only options now. The entire village came to see the killer confess. They even forced the ropemaker's son to watch as his father would tear at the rope with his nails, ripping them apart. The old man would cry for help, for mercy. But when no one answered, he shouted curses at them. He threatened and screamed. He pleaded and begged. But no one answered his cries. The hours passed and the water slowly rose. Desperate to escape, he tried to bite off his own foot. He would scream between the bites, tearing away flesh and tendons. However, he could no more get through his bone than he could his rope. In a last attempt, he tried to break his bone with his hands, but he could not do it. The pain was too great. His terrifying screams of agony and despair can still be heard to this day. If you listen closely at night, you can hear it in the distance. He was drowned and buried right here, under the water right beside us. The moon was high and full that night too. The rope maker made the rope that would be his death, with as much care and pride as all the others he had made before. And it would not budge or tear, no matter how hard he struggled. As the sun finally set, all the villagers were crying for the old man, ashamed of themselves for what they had done. Women and men, children and old people all cried, for the man and for themselves. The killer had not been found. The only one who didn't cry was the rope maker's son. He just sank to his knees and stared out at the horizon, eyes empty and cold. Even though the man had never confessed the murders seemed to have stopped. So the rope maker was the killer? A younger boy with big black eyes asked. No one knows, I answered. Wow, that was a great story, said the boy who at first had argued. Let's go take a midnight swim, he shouted to the group. Many of the other kids started to rise and follow him. Wait, I almost shouted. They all instantly stopped at the loudness of my voice and sank back down. Don't you want to know how the story ends? I asked. They all nodded. The fire was almost out at this point. Just an orange glow remained. I continued my story. Months passed, even years, without any sign of the killer. Soon, the world forgot about the incident, and the summer camps began again. They thrived for a couple of years, until something happened during their last summer camp before this one.
What happened?
Someone whispered softly. The last camp before this one was 20 years ago, and about 10 years after the rope maker's death, the mayor who had sentenced the rope maker had retired, and his children were taking part in the summer camp as counselors. Since it was the 10th year of camps, they decided to make it bigger and moved it farther away from the village. To celebrate the last day of the last week, a feast was held right where you are sitting now. A giant bowl of punch was brought out by the fire. Food and drink shared between happy teenagers, just like you. Even the counselors took part in drinking. Happy shouting and joyful music could be heard late into the night. Little did they know what gruesome fate awaited them. The next day, the sun rose and the sun set, without any of them returning. The mayor, worried about his children, decided to walk out to the beach where the feast had been held. What he found drove him mad. It is said that he simply continued walking into the sea to drown his sorrow and his life. It took yet another day for the locals to find the scene, and it was so terrifying, the entire village abandoned the island within the year. Hanging from a tree, one rope tied to each limb like a marionette, was the mayor's daughter. Her head had been cut off. It was found by the beach, sitting on a pile of rock, beside a corpse so mutilated it was not considered human. Arms and fingers twisted in cruel torture, and her entire body was covered in stabs and cuts. Her face was the worst of it. Her eyes had been gouged out, and then someone had poured acid into them, burning her entire face beyond recognition. On her forehead, carved all the way to the bone, was the text, "Mutilator." All the locals who had been working as counselors were tied, hand behind their backs, with a thick rope in their mouth, their kneecaps smashed and broken. Unable to move by themselves, they had been left there to watch the waves crashing against them, just barely reaching their feet. When they had been found, they were all sent to the hospital in town. None of them ever spoke of what they had been forced to witness. Later, they had found the corpses of the participants on the beach, tied to rocks and drowned by the tides. Most of them had been eaten by carnivorous fishes, but some had clear bite marks on their legs, just above where the noose had been tied. The locals say it was the spirit of the rope maker who did it. Others claim it was the gods. No one remains who lived through that incident. Most of the counselors who survived died soon thereafter from infections or dehydration. The few that lived later committed suicide by hanging. They never found the rope maker's son. He had vanished the day of the incident, never to be seen again for 20 years. And now the legend has almost been forgotten. Maybe someone needs to remind the world again. As I finished my story, I looked around. No one spoke for a minute. Nothing but a soft rustling of leaves and the nearby waves gushing against the beach. I could see the terror in their faces. They would not be swimming this night, and probably not for many nights to come. I slowly stood. The soft glow from the burnt-down fire was slowly dying. I drew in my breath and exhaled as hard as I could, right at the ashes. Smoke rose, and the little light that had been remaining faded in an instant. In the pitch-black darkness, girls and boys screamed and ran in all directions. I just stood there, laughing like a maniac. So that's the story of how I'm not allowed within 500 yards of any summer camp-related activities. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this and nothing more." Distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here for evermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more. Presently, my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is, I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you." Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the darkness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping, somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely this is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven. Ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore, tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast above the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing further than he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore." Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast, and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of never, nevermore." But the raven, still beguiling all my sad soul into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking Nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. "Wretch," I cried, "thy God hath lent thee. By these angels he hath sent thee respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." "Prophet," said I, "thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate and all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." "Prophet," said I, "thing of evil, prophet still if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden if, with the distant Aidenn, it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." "Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend?" I shrieked, upstarting. "Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." And that raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul, from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore. I was tucking my little sister into bed when she spoke up. "Can you sit with me until I fall asleep?" "Why?" I asked. "I thought you weren't afraid of the dark." "It's not the dark," Charlotte said. "It's the Twisted Lady." A chill shot down my spine. "Who?" "The Twisted Lady," my sister repeated. "She comes into my room and watches me as I sleep." Wordlessly, I lay down beside Charlotte and held her close. She fell asleep within minutes, but I stared up at the dark ceiling and tried to make sense of what I'd just heard. The Twisted Lady. I knew that name. When I was 3, I used to talk about a gnarled-looking woman who lived in the basement and only came out at night. I described her as having white eyes and a face like a skeleton. My parents assumed it was just a recurring nightmare and got a nightlight for my room. That seemed to help, and I grew up believing the Twisted Lady had been nothing more than a construct of my imagination. But now, 15 years later, my 7-year-old sister had seen her too. I stayed up with Charlotte all night, my sleep restless and uneasy. The next morning, I asked my mom if she told my sister about the Twisted Lady. "No, of course not. I wouldn't want to scare her." "Well, she was talking about her last night, though." "She must have overheard us discussing it." Mom's lips thinned with worry. "Oh, dear, I hope she doesn't start having nightmares like you did." That day, I could barely concentrate in school. I kept sifting through my memories, trying to find an image of the twisted lady. I was unsuccessful. When I got home, I searched the internet for clues, but nothing solid came up. All too soon, night rolled around again, and I stood outside Charlotte's door, listening to her speak with Mom. "The twisted lady will come. Honey, there's no such thing as a twisted lady. Trust me, you're completely safe." "She's real, Mama," Charlotte insisted. The desperation in her voice brought stinging tears to my eyes. "She really is. Honey, go to sleep, okay? It's going to be okay, I promise." She kissed my sister and walked out of the room. When she saw me standing in the hall, she gave me a reassuring smile and said, "Everything's okay." But it wasn't. Charlotte woke up that night screaming. "She was in here," she wailed when I burst into a room, my parents shadowing me. "The twisted lady was in here." I picked her up and rocked her. "It's okay, sweetie. You're safe with us." She sobbed as our parents came over and wrapped their arms around us both. We sat there hugging until Charlotte dozed off again. After tucking her back in, we went to bed, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. And that was just the beginning. A pattern emerged over the next 2 months. At least one night a week, Charlotte would scream out at night and insist that the twisted lady had been in her room. We would calm her and she would go back to sleep, only for it to happen again, a night or two later next week. Soon the physical effects of the nightmares became apparent. Plum-colored circles formed around Charlotte's pretty blue eyes. Her face was perpetually as pale as unbaked bread dough, and she moved as if her legs were too heavy for the rest of her body. She could barely stay awake, and we were all worried that she was only going to get worse. I still wasn't sure if I believed whether or not the twisted lady was real. I'm not really a skeptic, but I'd rather rule out all rational explanations before believing that there are paranormal forces at work. Also, I was afraid. I couldn't remember the twisted lady herself, but I did remember the terror she planted in me. A terror that seemed never to have left us after all. One night, on a weekend my parents were out of town, I came up with a plan. What if I could get physical proof that the twisted lady wasn't real? If Charlotte saw it herself, maybe the nightmares would stop. If she knew the twisted lady wasn't real, she wouldn't have to be afraid. I set up my father's camcorder in Charlotte's room, explaining to her that if the twisted lady came by, the device would pick her up. I then took my baby sister into my own room, and we crawled into bed and fell asleep. I woke up extremely early, just as the sun began to bleed through the hazy lavender sky. Rubbing my eyes, I stumbled into the hall, and my heart flew into my throat when I saw that Charlotte's door was open. I was sure I'd closed it the night before. Moving as quietly as I could in my slightly panicked state, I grabbed the camcorder and went downstairs to the living room, where I uploaded the video onto my laptop and sat on the couch to watch. The first few hours of footage were uneventful and showed nothing, which only added to my mounting dread. At around midnight, something could be heard shuffling awkwardly up the stairs. By the time it reached the hall, I was shaking, and I'd nearly bitten through the bottom of my lip. Very, very slowly, Charlotte's door squeaked open, and the most horrifying thing I have ever seen entered into my sister's room. It was a woman, a naked woman, who looked like nearly every bone in her body had been broken and then reset by the most incompetent doctors. She crab-walked on limbs bent sharply at bizarre angles, and her chest caved in as if she was missing whole sections of her ribs. Her spine and shoulders curved inward, forming a camel-like bump on the back and pushing her head down between her breasts. And the sounds she was making. Oh, God. It was a deep, raspy, guttural noise, caught somewhere between a moan and a gasp, and it made me want to claw my own ears off. She shuffled right up to Charlotte's bed and sat there for a while, as if not sure what to do next. Then, slowly, she began to turn her head, neck cracking loudly with the movement. Her long, stringy hair fell back as she looked right at the camera. Her face, to put it mildly, was grotesque. The skin was so taut I could see every contour of her skull and facial bones, and her eyes were rolled all the way back in her head, stark white. She had no visible lips, and her nose seemed to be caving in. I slammed the laptop shut and ran upstairs. After searching Charlotte's room and finding no sign of the monstrosity I'd just seen, I grabbed my still sleeping sister and fled to my best friend's house. I was in shock. I couldn't quite process what had just happened. That was 3 years ago. Charlotte hadn't seen the Twisted Lady in a long time, and I never showed my parents the footage. In fact, I deleted it. I didn't want what I'd seen to be real. But now I'm not so sure I made the right choice. You see, a month ago, my father was doing some homework in the basement when he discovered that some bricks in the wall had come loose. Further investigation revealed a makeshift grave where a broken human skeleton lay. The police haven't been able to identify the victim, but I know she's connected to the Twisted Lady. Since the discovery, past owners of the house have come forward and admitted to seeing her too. None of them imagined she was a possible murder victim. Then again, neither did my family. Looking back, I believe the Twisted Lady only wanted help. She wanted to tell someone who she was and what had happened to her, but she was unable to convey any of this. If I hadn't been such a coward and gotten rid of the footage, maybe her bones could have been discovered sooner. I hope they catch her killer, so that the sick bastard can be brought to justice. And I hope once he's been brought to justice, the Twisted Lady can finally be at peace. I was lying alone in my room when I heard the voice, deep and crackly, coming from beneath my bed. "Hey," the voice called out. I told myself I was just imagining it. "Hey, kid," the voice repeated. I drew my knees up to my chest and ducked my head under the blanket, trying to shut out the voice and the cold wind that drifted in through the window, ruffling the curtains. "Who are you?" I asked. "I am the monster under your bed," the voice replied. "You mean you're real?" I asked. "What do you mean? Of course I am real." "Do you have a name?" "Of course I have a name." "Oh, what is it?" "Frank." "Frank?" "Yeah," the monster said. "Is there something wrong with that?" "No, I mean, I don't know. It's just not very monsterly." "Well, my parents didn't want me to be a monster." "Really? What did they want you to be?"
A dentist.
That's funny, I said. I could feel myself beginning to smile. What do your parents want you to be?
What do your parents want you to be?
It asked. I don't know. Hey, Frank?
Yeah?
Aren't you gonna, scare me or something?
What? Why would I do that?
Well, you're a monster, aren't you?
Well, yeah, of course I am. But that doesn't mean I like to scare little kids.
But I thought that was your job.
It's my job to scare people, but only bad people.
Am I a bad person?
No,
He said.
but you're not the one I'm here to scare.
Who are you here to scare?
The man inside your closet.
The skin on my arms goose-fleshed up. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but I fell silent as I heard a rustling coming from the closet. The door creaked open, and I could hear soft footsteps padding towards me across the bedroom floor. I didn't dare peek out from the blanket. The footsteps stopped, and I could hear heavy breathing next to me. I squeezed my eyes tight. The warm sanctuary of the blanket disappeared as it was yanked off of me. I hugged my arms around my knees and prepared for the worst. A scream shattered the night air, followed by the sound of breaking glass from the direction of my window. I opened my eyes a crack to see a knife lying on the carpet next to my bed, blade glinting in the moonlight. My parents rushed into the room and asked me what had happened, but I didn't know what to say, only that someone had been hiding in my closet and they'd jumped out the window. My parents called 911, and the police came right away. They picked up a man called Gary Thompson, sprinting through the streets a couple of blocks away. He was covered in blood and broken glass. They found Gary's car abandoned on our property, and inside they found duct tape, knives, barbiturates, and a video camera. From what I later heard, Gary's lawyer employed an insanity defense, and Gary is currently incarcerated in a state mental facility for the criminally insane. I never heard from Frank the monster again, but the officer who arrested Gary told me that he sleeps on the floor of the facility. He tells the doctors that he's terrified of Frank, the monster under my bed.
To Capitol Hill to work out a compromise health care plan, he lost his voice after his State of the Union speech. A roof collapsed at a supermarket in France.
Ominous unknown killer is still at large. After weeks of unexplained murders, the ominous unknown killer is still on the rise. After little evidence has been found, a young boy states that he survived one of the killer's attacks and bravely tells his story.
I had a bad dream, and I woke up in the middle of the night.
Says the boy.
I saw that for some reason the window was open, even though I remember it being closed before I went to bed. I got up and shut it once more. Afterwards, I simply crawled under my covers and tried to get back to sleep. That's when I had a strange feeling, like someone was watching me. I looked up and nearly jumped out of my bed. There, in the little ray of light, illuminating from between my curtains, were a pair of two eyes. These weren't regular eyes. They were dark, ominous eyes. They were bordered in black and just plain out terrified me. That's when I saw his mouth, a long, horrendous smile that made every hair on my body stand up. The figure stood there, watching me. Finally, after what seemed like forever, he said it. A simple phrase, but said in a way only a madman could speak. He said,
Go to sleep.
I let out a scream. That's what sent him at me. He pulled up a knife, aiming it at my heart. He jumped on top of my bed. I fought back. I kicked, punched, rolled around, trying to get him off of me. That's when my dad busted in. The man threw the knife and it went into my dad's shoulder. The man probably would have finished him off if one of the neighbors hadn't alerted the police. They drove into the parking lot and ran towards the door. The man turned and ran down the hallway. I heard a smash, like glass breaking. As I came out of my room, I saw the window that was pointing towards the back of my house was broken. I looked out it to see him vanish into the distance. I can tell you one thing. I will never forget that face. Those cold, evil eyes and that psychotic smile. They will never leave my head.
Police are still on the lookout for this man. If you see anyone that fits the description in this story, please contact your local police department.
Jeff and his family had just moved into a new neighborhood. His dad had gotten a promotion at work, and they thought it would be best to move into one of those fancy neighborhoods. Jeff and his brother, Lou, couldn't complain though. I mean, they had a new, better house. What was not to love? As they were getting unpacked, one of their neighbors came by.
Hello,
She said,
I'm Barbara. I live across the street from you. Well, I just wanted to introduce myself and to introduce my son.
She turned around and called her son over.
Billy, these are our new neighbors.
Billy said hi and ran back to play in his yard. Well, said Jeff's mom, I'm Margaret, and this is my husband Peter and my two sons, Jeff and Lou. They each introduced themselves, and then Barbara invited them to her son's birthday. Jeff and his brother were about to object when their mother said they would love to. When Jeff and his family were done packing, Jeff went up to his mom. Mom, why would you invite us to some kid's party? If you haven't noticed, I'm not some dumb kid. Jeff, said his mother, we just moved here. We should show that we want to spend time with our neighbors. Now we're going to the party, and that's final. Jeff started to talk, but stopped himself, knowing that he couldn't do anything. He walked up to his room and plopped down on his bed. He sat there looking at the ceiling for what seemed like forever, when suddenly he got a weird feeling. Not so much pain, but a weird feeling. He dismissed it as a remnant of a dream, perhaps. He heard his mother calling him, and he left his room. The next day, Jeff walked downstairs for breakfast and got ready for school. As he sat there eating his cereal, he once again got that feeling. This time it was stronger. It gave him a slight tugging pain on his face, but he once again dismissed it. As he and Lou finished breakfast, they walked down to the bus stop. They sat there waiting for the bus when a kid on a skateboard jumped over them, only inches from their knees. They both started back in surprise. The kid landed and turned back to them. He kicked his skateboard up and caught it with his hands. The kid seemed to be about 12, 1 year younger than Jeff. He wore an Aeropostale shirt and ripped blue jeans.
Well, well, well. Looks like we got some new meat.
suddenly 2 other kids appeared. One was super skinny, and the other was huge.
Well, since you're new here, I'd like to introduce ourselves.
Jeff and Lou looked over to the skinny kid. He had a dopey face that you would expect a sidekick to have.
Over there is Keith, and he's Troy.
They looked over at the fat kid. This kid looked like he hadn't exercised since he was a baby.
And I am Randy,
said the first kid.
Now, for all the kids in this neighborhood, there's a small price for bus fare, if you catch my drift.
Lou stood up, ready to punch the lights out of the kid's eyes, when one of his friends pulled a knife on him.
I had hoped you would be more cooperative, but it seems we must do this the hard way.
The kid walked up to Lou and took his wallet out of his pocket. Jeff got that feeling again. Now it was truly strong, a burning sensation. He stood up, but Lou gestured him to sit down. Jeff ignored him and walked up to the kid. "Listen here, you little punk. Give my bro's wallet back, or else." Randy put the wallet in his pocket and pulled out his own knife.
Oh? And what will you do?
Just as he finished the sentence, Jeff popped the kid in the nose. As Randy reached for his face, Jeff grabbed the kid's wrist and broke it. Randy screamed, and Jeff grabbed the knife from his hand. Troy and Keith rushed Jeff, but Jeff was too quick. He threw Randy to the ground. Keith lashed out at him, but Jeff ducked and stabbed him in the arm. Keith dropped his knife and fell to the ground, screaming. Troy rushed him too, but Jeff didn't even need the knife. He just punched him in the stomach. As he fell, Troy puked all over. Lou could do nothing but look at Jeff in amazement.
"Jeff, how'd you—"
That was all he said. They saw the bus coming and knew they'd be blamed for the whole thing, so they started running as fast as they could. As they ran, they looked back and saw the bus driver rushing over to Randy and the others. As Jeff and Lou made it to school, they didn't dare tell what happened. All they did was sit and listen. Lou just thought of that as his brother beating up a few kids, but Jeff knew it was more. It was something scary. As he got that feeling, he felt how powerful it was, the urge to just hurt someone. He didn't like how it sounded, but he couldn't help feeling happy. He felt that strange feeling go away and stay away for the entire day of school. Even as he walked home due to the whole thing near the bus stop, and how he probably wouldn't be taking the bus anymore, he still felt happy. When he got home, his parents asked him how his day was, and he said in a somewhat ominous voice, "It was a wonderful day." Next morning, he heard a knock at the front door. He walked down to find 2 police officers at the door, his mother looking back at him with an angry look. "Jeff, these officers tell me that you attacked 3 boys, that it wasn't regular fighting either, and that they were stabbed. Stabbed, son." Jeff's gaze fell to the floor, showing his mother that it was true. "Mom, they were the ones who pulled the knives on me and Lou." "Son," said one of the cops, "we found 3 kids, 2 stabbed, 1 having a bruise on his stomach, and we have witnesses proving that you fled the scene." Jeff knew it was no use. He could say him and Lou had been attacked, but then there was no proof it was not them who attacked first. They could not say that they weren't fleeing, because truth be told, they were, so Jeff couldn't defend himself or Lou. "Son, call down your brother." Jeff couldn't do it, since it had been him who beat up all the kids. "Sir, It was me. I was the one who beat up the kids. Lou tried to hold me back, but he couldn't stop me. The cop looked at his partner, and they both nodded. Well, kid, looks like a year in juvie.
Wait!
Said Lou. They all looked up to see him holding a knife. The officers pulled their guns and locked them on Lou.
It was me! I beat up those little punks! Have the marks to prove it!
He lifted up his sleeves to reveal cuts and bruises, as if he was in a struggle. Son, just put the knife down, said the officer. Lou held up the knife and dropped it to the ground. He put his hands up and walked over to the cops. No, Lou, it was me. I did it. Tears ran down Jeff's face.
Poor bro. Trying to take the blame for what I did. Well, take me away.
The police led Lou out to the patrol car. Lou, tell them it was me. Tell them. I was the one who beat all those kids up. Jeff's mother put her hands on his shoulders. Jeff, please, you don't have to lie. We know it's Lou. You can stop. Jeff watched helplessly as the cop car sped off, with Lou inside. A few minutes later, Jeff's dad pulled into the driveway, seeing Jeff's face and knowing something was wrong. Son, what is it? Jeff couldn't answer. His vocal cords were strained from crying. Instead, Jeff's mother walked his father inside to break the bad news to him as Jeff wept in the driveway. After an hour or so, Jeff walked back into the house, seeing that his parents were both shocked, sad, and disappointed. He couldn't look at them. He could see how they thought of Lou when it really was his fault. He just went to sleep, trying to get the whole thing off his mind. 2 days went by with no word from Lou at the JDC. No friends to hang out with. Nothing but sadness and guilt. That was until Saturday, when Jeff woke up by his brother with a happy, sunshiny face. Jeff, it's the day, she said as she opened up the curtains and let light flood into his room. What? What's today? Asked Jeff as he stirred awake. Why, it's Billy's party. Mom, you're joking, right? You don't expect me to go to some kid's party after... There was a long pause. Jeff, we both know what happened. I think this party could be the thing that brightens up the past few days. Now get dressed. Jeff's mother walked out of the room and downstairs to get ready herself. He fought himself to get up. He picked out a random shirt and pair of jeans and walked downstairs. He saw his mother and father all dressed up, his mother in a dress and his father in a suit. He thought, why would they ever wear such fancy clothes to a kid's party? Son, is that all you're going to wear? Said Jeff's mom. Better than wearing too much, he said. His mother pushed down the feeling to yell at him and hid it with a smile. Now, Jeff, we may be overdressed, but this is how you go if you want to make an impression, said his father. Jeff grunted and went back up to his room. I don't have any fancy clothes, he yelled downstairs. Just pick out something, called his mother. He looked around in his closet for what he would call fancy. He found a pair of black dress pants he had for special occasions and an undershirt. He couldn't find a shirt to go with it, though. He looked around and only found striped and patterned shirts, none of which went with the dress pants. Finally, he found a white hoodie and put it on. You're wearing that? His parents both asked. His mother looked at her watch. No time to change. Let's just go," she said as she herded Jeff and his father out the door. They crossed the street over to Barbara and Billy's house. They knocked on the door, and at it appeared Barbara, just like his parents, way overdressed. As they walked inside, all Jeff could see were adults, no kids.
"The kids are out in the yard. Jeff, how about you go and meet some of them?"
said Barbara. Jeff walked out to a yard full of kids. They were running around in weird cowboy costumes and shooting each other with plastic guns. He might as well have been standing in a Toys R Us. Suddenly, a kid came up to him and handed him a toy gun and hat.
Hey, wanna play?
He said. No, kid. I'm way too old for this stuff." The kid looked at him with that weird puppy dog face.
Please?
Said the kid. "Fine," said Jeff. He put on the hat and started to pretend to shoot at the kids. At first he thought it was totally ridiculous, but then he started to actually have fun. It might not have been super cool, but it was the first time he had done something that took his mind off Lou, so he played with the kids for a while, until he heard a noise, a weird rolling noise. Then it hit him. Randy, Troy, and Keith all jumped over the fence on their skateboards. Jeff dropped the fake gun and ripped off the hat. Randy looked at Jeff with a burning hatred.
"Hello. Jeff, is it?"
he said.
"We have some unfinished business."
Jeff saw his bruised nose. "I think we're even. I beat the crap out of you, and you got my brother sent to JDC." Randy got an angry look in his eyes.
"Oh no, I don't go for even. I go for winning. You may have kicked our asses that one day, but not today."
As he said that, Randy rushed at Jeff. They both fell to the ground. Randy punched Jeff in the nose, and Jeff grabbed him by the ears and headbutted him. Jeff pushed Randy off him, and both rose to their feet. Kids were screaming, and parents were running out of the house. Troy and Keith both pulled guns out of their pockets.
"No interruptions or guts will fly,"
they said. Randy pulled a knife on Jeff and stabbed it into his shoulder. Jeff screamed and fell to his knees. Randy started kicking him in the face. After 3 kicks, Jeff grabbed his foot and twisted it, causing Randy to fall to the ground. Jeff stood up and walked towards the back door. Troy grabbed him. "Need some help?" He picked Jeff up by the back of the collar and threw him through the patio door. As Jeff tried to stand, he was kicked down to the ground. Randy repeatedly started kicking Jeff until he coughed up blood.
"Come on, Jeff. Fight me."
He picked Jeff up and threw him into the kitchen. At that moment, Randy saw a bottle of vodka on the counter and smashed it over Jeff's head.
"Fight!"
He threw Jeff back into the living room.
"Come on, Jeff. Look at me."
Jeff glanced up, his face riddled with blood.
"I was the one who got your brother sent to JDC, and now you're just gonna sit here and let him rot in there for a whole year. You should be ashamed."
Jeff started to get up.
"Oh, finally. You stand and fight."
Jeff was on his feet, blood and vodka smearing his face. Once again, he got that strange feeling, the one he hadn't felt for a while.
"Finally, he's up,"
said Randy. He ran at Jeff. Something inside Jeff snapped. His psyche was destroyed. All rational thinking was gone. All he could do was kill. He grabbed Randy and drove him into the ground. He got on top of him, punching him straight in the heart. The hit caused Randy's heart to stop. As Randy gasped his last breath, Jeff hammered down on him. blood gushed from Randy's body until he took one final breath and died. Everyone stared at Jeff. Then they pointed their guns at him. He looked up and saw the barrels trained on him and ran for the stairs. As he did, Troy and Keith opened fire, but both shots missed. Jeff ran up the stairs. He heard Troy and Keith following behind. As they fired their final rounds, Jeff ducked into the bathroom. He ripped the towel rack off the wall. Troy and Keith raced in, knives ready. Troy swung his knife at Jeff, who backed away and drove the towel rack into Troy's face. Troy went down hard. The only one left was Keith. He was more agile than Troy and ducked when Jeff swung the towel rack again. He dropped the knife and grabbed Jeff by the neck, pushing him into the wall. A bottle of bleach fell down on top of him from the shelf. It burned both of them, and they screamed. Jeff wiped his eyes as best he could. He pulled back the towel rack and swung it straight at Keith's head. As Keith lay there, bleeding to death, an ominous smile crept across his lips. "What's so funny?" asked Jeff. Keith pulled out a lighter and struck it. "What's funny," he said, "is that you're covered in bleach and alcohol." Jeff's eyes widened as Keith threw the lighter at him. As soon as the flame made contact with him, the flames ignited the alcohol and the vodka. While the alcohol burned him, the bleach bleached his skin. Jeff let out a terrible screech as he caught fire. He tried to roll on the fire, but it was no use. The alcohol had made him a walking inferno. He ran down the hall and fell down the stairs. Everyone started screaming when they saw Jeff, now enveloped in flames. He dropped to the ground, nearly dead. The last thing Jeff saw was his mother and other parents trying to extinguish the merciless tongues of fire. He passed out. When Jeff woke, he had wrappings all around his face. He couldn't see anything, but he felt a cast on his shoulder and stitches all over his body. He tried to stand up, but he realized that there was an IV in his arm. When he tried to get up, it fell out, and a nurse rushed in.
"I don't think you can get out of bed just yet,"
she said as she reinserted the tube. Jeff sat there with no vision, no idea of his surroundings. Finally, after hours, he heard his mother. "Honey, are you okay?" she asked. Jeff couldn't answer. His face was covered, and he was unable to speak. "Oh, honey, I have great news. After all the witnesses told the police that Randy confessed of trying to attack you, they decided to let Lou go." This made Jeff almost bolt upright. "He'll be out by tomorrow, and then you two will be able to be together again." Jeff's mom hugged him and said goodbye. For the next couple of weeks, Jeff's family visited him. Then came the day when his bandages were to be removed. His family were all there to support him and see how he had recovered. As the doctors unwrapped the bandages from his face, everyone held their breath. They waited until the last bandage fell away. "Let's hope for the best," said the doctor. He quickly pulled off the last cloth, letting the rest fall from Jeff's face. Jeff's mother screamed at what she saw. Lou and Jeff's dad stared, awestruck. What happened to my face?" Jeff said. He rushed out of bed and ran to the bathroom. He looked in the mirror and saw the cause of the distress. His face. It was horrible. His lips were burnt to a deep shade of red. His face had turned almost pure white, and his hair singed to black. He slowly put his hand to his face. The flesh had a sickening, leathery feel to it now. He looked back at his family, then at the mirror.
Jeff,
said Lou.
it's not that bad.
Not that bad, said Jeff. It's... it's perfect. His family began to weep, but Jeff started laughing, chuckling uncontrollably. His parents suddenly noticed that his left eye and hand were twitching. Jeff, are you okay? Okay, I've never felt more happy. Look at me, look at me. This face goes perfectly with me. He couldn't stop laughing. He stroked his face, feeling it, gazing back at his new reflection in the grungy mirror. Doctor, said Jeff's mom, is my son all right? You know, in his mind. Oh, yes. This behavior is typical for patients that have taken very large amounts of painkillers. If his behavior doesn't change in a few weeks, bring him back here, and we'll put him through a psychological test. Oh, thank you, doctor. Jeff's mother went over to him. Jeff, sweetie, it's time to go. Jeff looked away from the mirror, his face still warped with a crazy smile. Okay, Mommy. Okay. Okay. His mother took him by the shoulder and took him to get his clothes.
This is what came in,
said the lady at the desk. Jeff's mom looked down to see the black dress pants and white hoodie her son wore. Now they were clean of the blood and stitched together. Jeff's mother led him to his room and made him put his clothes on. Then they returned home. Later that night, Jeff's mother woke to a sound coming from the bathroom. It sounded as if someone was crying. She slowly went downstairs to see what it was. When she looked into the bathroom, she saw a horrendous sight. Jeff had taken a knife from the kitchen and carved a smile into his cheeks. Jeff, what are you doing? His mother cried. Jeff slowly glanced over at her. I couldn't keep from smiling, Mommy. It hurt after a while. But now, I don't have to try to smile. See? It's carved on my face. Now, I can smile forever. Jeff's mother noticed his eyes, ringed and black. Jeff, your eyes! His eyes seemed incapable of closing. I couldn't see my face. I got tired, and my eyes started to close. I burned out the eyelids, so I could always see myself. My new face. Jeff's mother slowly started to back away. What's wrong, Mommy? Aren't I beautiful? Yes, son, she said. Yes, you are. Let me go get Daddy, so he can see your new face. She ran into the room and shook Jeff's dad from his sleep. Honey, come quickly. She stopped as she saw a shadow darken the doorway. The shape of a knife appeared next to the figure's shadow on the floor. Mommy, you lied. Jeff rushed at them. His brother Lou woke up, startled by some noise. He didn't hear anything else, so he just shut his eyes and tried to go back to sleep. As he was on the bleak edge of slumber, he got the strangest feeling that someone was watching him. He looked up just before Jeff's hand covered his mouth. Jeff slowly raised the knife above his brother's head. Lou thrashed, trying to escape Jeff's grip. "Shh," Jeff said. "Just go to sleep." Halloween Fun by Navy Wife JP. I have more under my belt, but here's a memory from when I was younger. My dad was the coolest guy on the block, probably because he was one of the 3 black dads who lived in our town. The population is around 98% Caucasian, and that's not an exaggeration. He was a state police officer, intimidating, wore Oakleys before the hipsters, and he was generally a rough-sounding person. Damn, do I miss him. But the one thing he feared the most was Halloween. He would tell my sister and I stories at night about his life when he was in high school in slums in New Jersey, and that every Halloween, crazy things would happen. He may have been pulling our legs a bit, but at that stage in our lives, we didn't care. When Halloween would roll around, he would take us out while Mum stayed home to trick-or-treat. One night in 5th grade, Lexi and I were dressed as a witch and a 50s poodle skirt girl. Dad held our hands, walking to the last street, when I realized I'd lost Mom's scarf she'd let me borrow. She loved that old thing, so we walked all the way back towards the darker corner of our street to find it. It's by the woods in a small stream, and in the daylight you can see pretty well. But when it's dark, you can't see anything. Dad said he'd seen something and walked towards it. When he'd got there, he started slowing down. He was staring at something in the dark that we couldn't see. Lexi called out to him if he'd found Mom's scarf. He told her to be quiet and started crouching down, looking into the distance. For several minutes, we stood there waiting. I could make out the scarf above his head, tied to a branch. He grabbed the tied scarf, still staring into the dark, and started backing away. Then Dad screamed and sort of shuffled backwards. It was a low, throaty scream like he was furious. He was swearing, but I don't remember what. Whatever Dad had been staring at then bolted out of the trees and ran down the street opposite of where we lived. It was a little child, probably a boy from his silhouette shape, and in a black costume with skeleton bones on the front and a skull mask. When Lexi and I tried to go over and see what happened, Dad yelled for us to stay back. He got onto his ancient cell phone and called Mom to come and pick us up. His next call was to the local police. Lexi and I left before we could see anything, but the next day Mom told us about the dead, skinned animals that had been found. By the time us kids could go look, they'd taped off the place and taken out the bloody animals. But there were still the stains on the pavement, and the smell was absolutely terrible. The kids talked about it in school a little, and I was curious if they'd ever caught the boy. Nothing came out in the local papers though, and it was quickly forgotten. Eventually Dad could have told me more, but it was the last Halloween we'd spend together. But I do remember him and Mom arguing for the next couple of days about ever letting us trick-or-treat again. Halloween Eve by P. Sprouse. I actually have 2 stories I'd like to share, but I'm waiting on permission to share the one that happened to my best friend, which I was also heavily involved in. So I'll start with the one that happened to my own family. Back in 2008, I think, I had graduated high school, but was still living at my parents' house, along with my younger brother and sister, who at the time were in high school and junior high respectively. It was Halloween Eve, meaning the next day was Halloween, and we were all asleep in our beds. Now, I have to tell you that although we lived on a nice-ish street, we lived in a town known for gangs and drug deals and random crazy weirdos. It was a little scary to hear gunshots and police sirens in the distance every night. But, hey, it was home. Anywho, about at 4 a.m., I woke up to what sounded like a gunshot on our front porch, followed by a shouting and violent pounding on our front door. I, being curious, but also scared out of my mind, creeped up to my second-floor window and peered out the front yard that had an obstructed view of the porch. This was all I could see, and aside from hearing a regular stream of cursing and more pounding on the door, I had no clue what was going on for what seemed like hours. But in reality, it probably was no more than 20 minutes. Finally, and quite startlingly I might add, my brother came bursting into my room and asked if I was okay. I told him yes, and what in the name of heck is going on? Also, if you get that reference, you're streets ahead. He told me this. Some weirdo was at our front door. He had knocked on the door, and my dad had heard and went to see what was happening. He peered through the glass and saw a man on our front porch, to whom he asked what was wrong, without opening or unlocking the door. The man answered, They're after me, repeatedly while glancing back behind him. My dad, seeing that there was no one behind him on the dimly lit street, asked if he would like to use our phone. The guy said yes, so my dad grabbed our house phone and handed it to him through the doorway he had cracked open. The man tried to push his way in, but thankfully Dad stopped him and locked the door. He then proceeded to call the police on the phone the man had opted not to take. That was the story up to that point, when my brother came in to check on me. Isn't he such a nice brother? At that point, the man had started screaming profanities, yanking the door handle back and forth violently, and pounding on the walls. And then I heard the glass shatter. The man had taken a chair from the front porch and thrown it through the front window, which led to my parents' bedroom. I don't remember, but I'm pretty sure I was bawling at this point, knowing for sure that he was now in the house. And I remember I woke up to what I thought was a gunshot. I thought about how he was going to kill my parents first, and then run upstairs and kill me and my brother. My mind raced at all the horrible things that could be happening downstairs, when amazingly the police pulled right up at that moment. They immediately came into the house and detained the guy. Apparently he had climbed through the window, cutting himself on the glass, and crawled on all fours through my parents' bedroom and through the kitchen. Finally ended up on our living room floor, where he just laid down and bled all over the carpet. He didn't have any weapons on him, and despite my original theory of him having a gun, I guess I thought, in my rudely awoken state, that the pounding on the door was a gunshot. He was apprehended before he did anything to anyone in my family, thankfully. We think he was just a druggie who was hallucinating that someone was chasing him or some shit. No charges were filed, and we never saw the guy again. After the police and ambulance left, my dad cleaned up what he could of the bloody mess, and we all went to bed. Unfortunately, we all forgot about my little sister, who was downstairs in the bedroom in the back of the house. No one had gone to check on her, and no one had told her what had happened after it was all over. So she spent the entire night cowering under her blankets, thinking something could still be happening. God damn. We have since all apologized to her. So that's my story. Even though it was the most frightening experience of my life thus far, at least something good came of it, right? Since he bled all over our carpet, our insurance paid for new carpet, which we already desperately needed, and it was enough to carpet several new rooms. Way more than were actually ruined. So there's that. The Most Eventful Halloween by KRC 1130. The events happened in October 2013. Obviously, since it's Halloween. I was 10 years old and in the 6th grade. Where I am from, the middle schools got out after the elementary and high schools. As a result, my friends and I knew that we would have to start trick-or-treating immediately if we wanted to get any candy at all. Remember, Halloween of 2013 was on a Friday. This really excited us. We could hit every house we wanted and didn't have to worry about school the next day. After school, our parents picked us up and drove us to our friend Alex's house. He lived on a road named South Herald. To the left of South Herald was an identical street named South Concord. At the end of one side of South Herald was a turn that brought you to South Concord. On the other side was the main road. Alec lived closer to the main road, so our plan was to start at his house, go to the main road, then turn up and go down Concord. After that, we'd go back down Herald and return to Alec's house. So we began trick-or-treating. There was probably 12 of us, or so I remember, but the notable ones were Alec, myself, Nate, and James. We had been accruing a great deal of candy when we got to this fateful house. It was unlike any other house. 2 stories, a garage, front lawn, etc. However, there was a Michael Myers statue in the front lawn. We went up to the house, got candy, and examined the statue closely. It was holding a hideous knife and was hunched over. James suddenly decided that it would be a good idea for us to kick in the shin and do a little Halloween vandalism. Suddenly, the statue jumped and began holding its shin. We were frightened that the statue was actually a dude. "I'm gonna kill you," said the man. Obviously, plenty of people claim to want to kill someone and not really mean it. At the time, we just assumed that it was an idle threat and continued on our way. At like 8:30, it was pretty dark out. I lived up north at the time, and anyone who lives up there can agree that it gets dark pretty quickly. Anyway, we were still collecting candy when Nate and I began discussing the science behind slasher films, like who gets offered up first and why. One of the people we were with, who was in the middle of the pack, dropped his bag of candy suddenly. We all stopped and waited for him to pick it up. Now, the person had to turn around to pick up his bag. When he lifted up his head, he began to squint as if he was trying hard to see something. We all turned to see what he was looking at, and then we saw the Michael Myers costume walking behind us. It was odd. No one else was with him. Hell, we were the only group on the road. He was still holding onto the knife. When he noticed we were looking at him, he quickened his pace. Being stupid preteens, we booked it. Looking over my shoulder, I realized he was starting to run too. Fortunately for my slow ass, he was a decent length behind us. Our luck even turned more into our favor when a minivan stopped at the end of Concord. It was one of our friend's mothers. We all piled into the minivan and quickly told her that someone was chasing us. She drove us all back to Alec's house. What makes this story even worse is that Alec and Nate told me that the man was still roaming the streets after we had all left. I don't think I really have felt so terrified. Honestly, I have never left the house on Halloween ever since. Whether the knife this guy had was real or not is irrelevant to me. It's one of those things that I had no intention of knowing, Just in case it was real and all. I suppose this story pales in comparison to some of the other experiences here, and I'm not really much of a storyteller. Still, I hope you enjoy my misfortune. TLDR, go trick-or-treating, see a dude in the lawn. Later, the same dude chases us with a knife. Alone on Halloween by Tasha Lou 96. This all happened back in 2014. I went out on a night for Halloween during my first year at university. I was wearing high-heeled boots and a leather jacket. Over the course of the night, drunk me had taken them off and left them at the group's table, due to being too uncomfortable, as I'm sure you can imagine. By the end of the night, I'd practically danced my way to near sobriety and went to my group's table. However, they'd gotten up from the table, and my boots and jacket were nowhere to be seen. Someone had stolen them. Whatever, they weren't expensive, and I rarely wore them anyway. Now, however, I had to walk the 15 minutes back to my accommodation. I didn't have any money for a taxi, so I thought I'd just walk back slowly. I asked one guy, the jerk in the group that everyone hated, if he could just keep me company, because he was tall. He laughed and said no, and walked off, dragging the only girl who was also shoeless with him. So I was walking alone, shoeless in a busy city center, watching out for broken glass or anything that would be harmful or disgusting. Everyone else was so far ahead that I couldn't see them, but I just kept going. I was about halfway to my place when I was stopped by a Middle Eastern man. The city I lived in was very culturally diverse. He asked if I was okay, and I was grateful someone cared enough to make sure I was all right. He offered even to help walk me home, so I accepted for at least part of the way. He was very kind and told me his name was Omar. He started saying how beautiful he thought I was and how lucky he was to have me. This unsettled me slightly. Once I was around the corner from my house, I thanked Omar and said I'd walk the rest of the way on my own. He instantly looked offended. "Don't you want to invite me in for a cup of tea to thank me?" I told him no, because I didn't know him at all. He kept hold of my wrist. "Why can't I have a kiss for helping you?" Again I declined, and his grip tightened. "Well, do I get a hug for being your friend then?" By this point, I just wanted him to let go, so I gingerly gave him a hug. Then he grabbed me and tried to kiss me, and I pressed my lips together instead. He just licked up my face. I finally got free and started walking away, but he followed me. I sped up, and so did he. I abandoned my checking for glass on the ground and began sprinting, now terrified as I heard him running behind me. I got out my phone and called my friend Rob, who I begged to help me. But then I found out Omar was no longer following me. He was nowhere to be seen. But I needed someone to keep me safe. My friend thankfully agreed, and he got to my flat not long after with a knife in case Omar was still there. I told the people in my group my story, and they were mortified that they left me alone. I returned home for a week because I was so thoroughly shook up. Now on a night out, I make sure everyone is so close to me that it won't happen again, or to anyone else. Burning Corpses in a Car Before Halloween by Sirsit Azan Man. This story happened the night before Halloween back in 2010. At that time, I was a freshman in college, living on campus. That has significance later on. That year, the 31st fell on a Monday, so student festivities went on the Saturday before. During the afternoon at around 7, I was outside playing soccer on a field near to my place when I noticed an SUV driving by several times. I only noticed this vehicle because we were kicking the ball over the fence several times by accident, and that car was present at least twice when we climbed over the fence to retrieve the ball. I didn't think much of it at the time and proceeded to go to the party later that night. My girlfriend and a few friends and I left around 9:30, and we noticed a helicopter in the sky with a bright floodlight attached to it, seemingly scanning the area. We proceeded to party, and I didn't fret over it. The party was on the other side of the campus, and so we missed all the sirens and flashing lights racing up and down the street. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me go back for a minute. We got back from the party at around 11 p.m., and I immediately noticed that not only was the first helicopter still in the air around my campus apartment, but that there was a steady stream of police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks driving up and down the street nearby. However, none of them had their lights or sirens on, so I wasn't really alarmed. The next day on the internet, though, I found that an SUV had been found blazing in the parking lot, with a woman's body inside. What was more, I found out this happened about 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile from where I lived. I guess during the party the area was crawling with police and other authorities, all trying to look for clues. My roommate later told me that there were non-stop sirens for a good 20 minutes after I left for the party. In the next few weeks, more info surfaced, saying that a man had killed his wife and tried to burn the body. He broke her neck as well and bludgeoned her body. If the news articles below are to be trusted, slight discrepancies with timing of course, the killer was lighting his wife's body on fire during the exact same time I was getting dressed up in my Woody costume. But it wasn't until a few weeks later that I made a connection between the SUV I saw in the article and the one I'd seen while playing soccer. I found out that while I was playing soccer, someone was driving within 20 yards of me with a corpse in their car, especially since it was on the campus of a very secure university in a very safe city. After reading the article in more detail, the teeth did indeed belong to the victim. My guess is the murderer hit his wife so hard in the teeth that they were knocked into her throat.